Yeah, my name's Charlie, and I'm a conservation scientist at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent. So my main concern has always been the ecological crisis, the destruction of nature. Over the last few years, I've been teaching an undergraduate course on climate change, and I've become even more worried by the climate crisis than I was about the ecological crisis. And this growing knowledge I've had about both crises has forced me into becoming an activist. So that's what I'd like to speak to you about today. What I believe is the role of scientists in this planetary emergency. So I know you all know about this planetary emergency that we're in, but just to give you a brief recap, perhaps there are some on Facebook that don't know all about it. So our planet is heating incredibly fast. These warming stripes show changes in temperature on an annual basis. And over the last few years, we're starting to see the impact of that warming more and more frequently. So we've reached a global average of 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And just last year, this was starting to have some severe impacts. So we saw the hottest day ever recorded on planet Earth in California. In June, it was 38 degrees in Arctic Siberia. So it was as hot in the Arctic Circle as it has ever been in the UK. We've seen extraordinary wildfires across North and South America. In Russia, 27 million acres of forest burnt in Siberia last year. And of course, we heard about Australia the year before. In China, 4 million people were displaced by floods. There were another 4 million people in India and Nepal. We had the busiest ever Atlantic hurricane season. There were 30 named storms, and they had to move on to the Greek alphabet to name these storms because they run out of letters. And we saw the strongest ever storm in the Philippines. That's just at 1.1 degrees. Before the end of the century, we're looking probably at 4 degrees under a high emission scenario. And of course, 4 degrees averaged across the planet means very different temperatures in different places in the planet. If we look in the Arctic, 4 degrees globally looks more like 10 degrees or more in the Arctic. And of course, this will have huge impacts on human systems and on the natural world. So for some reason, this map isn't very clearly defined on my slideshow. I apologize for that. But this map highlights the problem of human migration that will be caused by climate change. So the areas in black here are places that have a mean annual temperature of greater than 29 degrees centigrade, and they currently cover less than 1% of the Earth's land surface. And at such temperatures, human life is essentially impossible. What's really concerning is that by 2070, under a high emission scenario, areas with a mean annual temperature of greater than 29 degrees will have expanded to cover all the area with brown hatching here. So that's all of northern half of South America, Northern Africa and the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, much of India, Southeast Asia, and Northern Australia. This is 1/3 of the current global human population are currently living in places that will be uninhabitable in 50 years' time. The big risk of climate change for humanity, of course, is the risk of societal collapse, the collapse of human civilization. There's increasing research on this. This is one causal link diagram from a paper published last month, and showing that the main risk of collapse of civilization may come from food insecurity, what we call multiple breadbasket failure, climate change causing the collapse of food production in several of the world's major breadbaskets at once. Of course, Climate change is also impacting the natural world, and many of our most important, our richest biomes may not survive beyond the end of this century. So we know about polar sea ice, of course, but it's rapidly becoming clear that tropical forests may not survive climate change because of the drying effects and the vulnerability to fire that this causes. We also know that coral reefs, which are the rainforests of the sea, they cover less than 1% of the oceans, but contain 50% of marine life. They are also threatened because they are highly vulnerable to warm oceans. So we're talking about a world without tropical forests and without coral reefs by the end of this century. So that's the climate crisis. We're also suffering an ecological crisis with the destruction of nature. So, the destruction and degradation of habitats, the overharvesting of many species, ecological disruptions caused by the disappearance of some species from within ecosystems. We have problems of invasive species. We have increasing pollution problems, and not just plastic pollution and chemical pollution, but the systematic poisoning of our agricultural landscapes. And then, of course, there's climate change and its equally evil twin, ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is not caused by climate change, but it's also caused by the increase of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. And it means that creatures that live in the ocean that secrete a shell, things that make a calcium carbonate shell, like mollusks and crustaceans, they're not able to do that in an acidic ocean. So we fear the collapse of oceanic food chains in the future. These two crises are two sides of the same coin, and they feed into each other. So climate change is the biggest threat to the natural world. It threatens the natural world directly, as we saw with the coral reefs and the tropical forests, but it also threatens the natural world indirectly through human reactions to climate change. How we mitigate climate change and how we adapt to climate change is causing an additional pressure on nature. At the same time, our destruction of nature accelerates climate change, and it undermines our capacity to survive climate change. So this is an emergency. It really is. And over nearly 14,000 scientists now have signed the World Scientists' Warning of a climate emergency. There were 161 signatories from Sweden. I'm sure there are people in this room who have signed this declaration of a climate emergency. So the question now is what we do about this as scientists. We have generated the knowledge that has allowed us to understand the severity of the problem. We have also generated solutions to this problem that society is largely choosing not to implement. So what do we do about it? Well, first, we need to consider what this word emergency means. When Bill Ripple and colleagues published that paper, the warning of a climate emergency, they chose this word very carefully because an emergency is an urgent situation that requires us to stop what we are doing and to take urgent action to address the emergency at hand. And it means in an emergency, we don't do things in the normal way anymore. It means we act, as Greta Thunberg suggests, as if our house is on fire. And if my neighbor's house over there was on fire, I would not behave in the normal way. I would not send them a text message to ask if it's okay if I come round. And then I would not ring the doorbell to ask, to wait for them to allow me in. I would run over there and I would kick down the door and I would, try and rescue whoever was inside, because that is what we do in an emergency. But despite the fact that scientists are saying it's an emergency, most of us are not acting like it. And I think this is partly because we feel that as scientists, we are already doing what we can to make the required change happen. We are already um, acting to make a better world by providing information. But clearly, that is not enough. Clearly, the situation is still getting worse. So we have to re-examine our assumptions. Is what we are doing as scientists enough to make the change we need? And I think we need to examine our theories of change. And there are two key theories of change, that sort of unspoken theories of change that scientists have. The first, I think, is that our job is to generate information. And if we generate information, our society's leaders will use that information to make wise decisions. They will make decisions that benefit humanity. They will make decisions for the greater good. Our second assumption is that if we warn people of the consequences of inaction, then people will force their leaders to take the required action. And you don't see these theories of change written down. They're unspoken, but I'm convinced that many of us as scientists, we sort of operate under these assumptions, but these assumptions are false. So the first theory of change, that if we generate information, our leaders will use that information to make wise decisions. This is demonstrably not true. Governments do not listen to scientists because they are driven by an imperative of economic growth, and they respond primarily to corporate lobbyists. They also respond to public pressure, which we'll come to in a moment. So, in 2020, the oil and gas sector spent $136 million in political contributions, and a further $110 million on lobbying of politicians in just one country, in just the USA. This is money spent by the fossil fuel industry to influence politicians. Scientists do not influence politicians in the same way. And of course, that's just, I've just highlighted lobbying money from the oil and gas industry. That doesn't include the coal industry. That doesn't include the plastics lobby. That doesn't include the agricultural pesticides lobby. All of these lobbies that are spending lots and lots of money to prevent political change. And we come here to what George Monbiot calls the pollution paradox. The dirtier an industry is, the more it has to spend on lobbying governments to prevent itself from being regulated out of existence. And that means that governments tends to be, their campaign finance tends to be dominated by the very dirtiest industries. And governments tends to govern for the very dirtiest industries. And we know this assumption that leaders will act on the science is false, because we can see it in the outcomes, real world outcomes. There has been delay and delay and delay in having legislation to limit climate change, and as a result, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere continue to rise, despite 4 decades of scientific warnings. Our other theory of change is that if we warn the public about the necessity of action, the public will force their leaders to take the required action. But the thing is, those same fossil fuel industries and other dirty industries that are directly paying politicians, they are also investing heavily in the climate change counter movement organizations and science denialism. 4 decades of trying to create doubt about the science of climate change, create doubt in the minds of the public that this was something that was required. And as a result, the public does not demand the action that is required from our leaders. So we come to the realization that science alone cannot trigger the transformative change required at the urgent speed required, because it ignores the processes that most powerfully influence political and policy change, and it does not address the forces that are so heavily invested in preventing the required change. And of course, many of us already recognize that the work we do as scientists is not enough. That's why in our spare time as private citizens, we also write letters to politicians. We also sign petitions to try and achieve change. And we also, if things get really desperate, we will go on a sanctioned march from A to B. We will, in other words, we adopt advocacy positions and we engage in traditional campaigning. But we know that the traditional campaigning is also not working. If the traditional campaigning had been working, then we would not be continuing to see rises in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration. So clearly it's not working. So we have to ask ourselves, if our science that we carry out as professionals is not enough, and if the campaigning that we do as private citizens is not enough, then is there something else we can do that is more effective? And I believe, and I think history demonstrates, that there is another method to trigger radical social change, and that is non-violent civil disobedience, direct action. When we think of many of the most prominent social changes that took place in the 20th century, the struggle for universal suffrage, for votes for women, the struggle for independence from empire, and the struggle for civil rights for people of color. These were struggles that were achieved in large part through non-violent civil disobedience. And the people who engaged in that civil disobedience, they were wildly unpopular at the time. They were hated in the press. And they were, people consider them to be dangerous dissenters. But today, we recognize them as heroes because they triggered the changes that were needed. And history has proved them right. For the last 3 years or so, as the impacts of climate change and the destruction of nature have become so apparent, we have seen the birth of popular environmental civil disobedience movements. Of course, there has been environmental civil disobedience for decades, but it has never achieved mass movement status until the last few years. And this was this started partially in Sweden with Greta Thunberg and the global youth strike movement, which she inspired. And we're on a Fridays for Future Day today, so there are youth all over the world striking for climate today. And in the UK, there has been, alongside that, there has been Extinction Rebellion. And of course, there are other movements in other parts of the world. Extinction Rebellion is also growing to be a global movement, just as the youth strike movement is. And over the last few years, I've been so inspired by these movements that I am moving away from research myself and dedicating more and more of my time to activism. So I engage with activism. I engage in activism with scientists, with Extinction Rebellion and a group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And I've written a few papers and articles in journals like this one in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, highlighting the need for scientists to move beyond words and take part in action, move from publications to public actions. And this is why I think